So for the next hour, we'll be talking about an overview of the condition of Indiana's waters, focused on data that's just come out in 2018, and then we'll talk about 3 key challenges in the policy realm. Indiana is a water-rich state with more than 62,000 miles of streams, more than 1,500 lakes that occupy more than 130,000 lake acres, 67 miles of shore on Lake Michigan, and more than 900,000 wetlands. But as you know, our waters have challenges, and of course we just heard from Dr. Reuter about key challenges. Each year, our Department of Environmental Management, or IDEM, monitors waters around the state, and every other year they issue their water monitoring report. So for the next few slides, I'd like to look at what was in the 2018 water monitoring report. This map from the report illustrates the impairment challenge that we have around the state. Impairment means water quality that does not meet our state water quality standards. Both categories 4 and categories 5 are roughly the same. They both indicate impaired waters. Category 4 just means that there's some sort of plan in place that is projected to resolve that, impairment eventually. Starting with the streams, and then we'll go on to the lakes. IDEM has to date assessed more than 32,000 miles of stream for full body contact and found that currently 76% of those are impaired. For fishing, 63% of the assessed miles are impaired, and for aquatic life, 32% of the assessed miles are impaired. And so the next table that we're going to look at will be the causes of those impairments. These are the top causes of impairment, and of course E. coli really takes the cake on this, with more than 24,000 miles impaired by E. coli. Impaired biologic communities, PCBs in fish tissue, oxygen depletion, and nutrients are all significant causes of impairment as well. The item table goes on and lists another dozen or so causes of impairment, all of which are less than 1,000 stream miles. E. coli is an important bacterium. We measure it in our water because it's a gut bacterium from both animals and people. It's a measure of fecal contamination of our waterways. And so the next tables in the IDEM report look at what the sources are of the E. coli or the PCBs or nutrients. And when it comes to fecal contamination, that contributes both to the E. coli impairments, but it also contributes to nutrient impairment of our waters. So this slide lists the sources of impairment from human bodily waste, from our sewage. And what tops the list is the unsewered areas, places where we have septic systems, and in particular leaking septic systems, or in some cases even straight piping, meaning untreated sewage is directed into either a ditch, a stream, or an agricultural tile from which it goes straight into the waterways. Oddly enough, as important as our combined sewer overflow problems are, they're estimated to impair only 1,500 stream miles compared to 7,400 stream miles for our leaking septics and straight piping. The municipal sewer discharges and small sewage treatment plants are treating the sewage, but they still release nutrients into our streams, and sometimes when their treatment isn't adequate, they are releasing bacteria as well. So they're part of the impairment problem. And then livestock. Livestock is estimated to contribute more than 10,000 stream miles of impairment for the animal feeding operations. Grazing comes in at about 6,000 stream miles, and then 2,000 stream miles for animal agriculture not otherwise specified, and 1,800 for runoff from confined feeding. The last one on the list, unrestricted cattle access, at under 1,000 stream miles, that would be cattle that are able to run into streams. They're not fenced out of the streams. And then this last slide were the remaining significant sources listed by IDEM. Of course, waterfowl and wildlife also contribute to fecal contamination at about 4,000 stream miles each. Crops with tile drainage contribute to about 2,600 stream miles impaired through their conduction of nutrients into the water. And then urban stormwater runoff is estimated to contribute to about 1,100 impaired stream miles. So we've looked at the stream side. Next, we'll look at the lake side of IDEM's assessment. IDEM assesses our lakes and measures them by lake acres. They've assessed a total of 38,000 lake acres for full body contact and found that 21% are impaired. They've assessed more than 80,000 lake acres for fishability and found 49% impaired, and then 52% impairment for aquatic life. And the causes of impairment for our lake acres, you can see reflect somewhat the fact that they've assessed more acres for fishability. PCBs in fish impairing 33,000 lake acres, and mercury in fish impairing 6,000 lake acres. Chlorophyll A is a measure of algal content of the water, and so it's a reflection of nutrient contamination at 16,000 acres. And then phosphorus at 7,000 acres, and E. coli just under 1,000 lake acres impaired. So with the IDEM report, we've had a chance to look at our streams and our lakes. We've also had data in 2018 about the condition of our groundwater. And groundwater is important. 67% of Indiana's drinking water comes from groundwater, and about 26% of Hoosiers use their own private well as their drinking water source. Groundwater, like surface water, can be impacted by the things that are going on the land surface, either application of fertilizer or pesticides, manure, waste sites, landfills, petroleum stations, salt on roads. All of those things can be carried by our rainwater or snowmelt either into our streams and lakes or downward through the soil and into our groundwater. The Indiana Groundwater Monitoring Network released an update in 2018. They've been assessing groundwater since 2008. They take samples from between 300 and 400 wells per year and test them for 200 different contaminants. This is a list of some of the contaminants that showed up the most often, most of these, arsenic, strontium, and nitrate, of course, have health impacts. I've included iron and sodium, both because they show up in a significant number of our wells, but also because there are some people who, for medical reasons, have to limit iron or sodium in their diets. So this is an important reminder to all of us that private wells really need to get tested, and because they're not regulated, it's up to the owner to get them tested. The monitoring network also tested for pesticide residues and found that between 10 and 12% of our wells test positive for pesticide residues. Again, because what's going on the land surface can be carried downward into the groundwater. In 2018, we also received reports for the first time systematically evaluating groundwater at our coal ash locations. And at each of these red triangles, we have coal ash impoundments. And what we learned from the monitoring reports is that everywhere we have coal ash without a liner under it, we have contaminated groundwater. So there are challenges to our groundwater as well as our surface water. Another challenge that we have to our water resources are the changes in climate, the fact that we're seeing warmer temperatures and changes in precipitation. And this year, in 2018, there were significant reports released by the Purdue Climate Research Center and the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment Project. These reports related to aquatic ecosystems, public health, and agricultural impacts of the changing climate. Their report on water resources is due out soon, but there was information in the 2018 reports that relates to our water. In particular, they've predicted that by 2050, Indiana could see 80 to 100 days per year above 86 degrees. And 86 degrees and above, of course, we'd be seeing more water loss to evaporation out of our soil. 86 degrees is also a temperature at which you start to see impacts on livestock. They've predicted that we'll be getting more precipitation in spring, and by 2050 could have as much as a 30 to 50% increase in tile drainage. Less rain is predicted for our summer months. Unfortunately, August and September are already our drier months. And so the Purdue Research Center has predicted that by 2050 we could see a 16 to 20% drop in corn yields and a 9 to 11% drop in soybean yields. And as Dr. Yoder mentioned, we're seeing an increase in the number of intensive rainfall events. Climate change also has an impact on lakes. The Purdue report on aquatic ecosystems has some significant points, including that our lakes will see longer periods of stratification, and when there's stratification, that means a lack of mixing, and the deeper waters will be depleted in oxygen faster. And this will mean an increased loss in our cold water species like cisco and rainbow trout. Warmer temperatures also increase the risk of algal blooms. So those are some of the reports we've seen in 2018 talking about the condition of Indiana's waters. From there, I'd like to talk about some of the key things related to water that went on in the 2018 legislature, and then I'll end with some of the things we're watching going into the 2019 session. One of the bills that passed was Senate Bill 362 about drinking water and wastewater utilities, requiring that more of those utilities come under regulation by the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, more requirements for those utilities that apply for revolving loan funds, and prior to construction of a new wastewater or drinking water facility, requirements for an alternatives analysis, i.e. whether that facility is really needed or if you could consolidate with other nearby facilities to get the job done, capital asset management, and cybersecurity. The reason we're watching these utility bills is that our sewage treatment has a significant impact on the health of our rivers and lakes. A water infrastructure task force was written into two bills, and those were combined and eventually passed as House Bill 1267. I wasn't able to find a picture that showed the entire task force. There were 14 members. They met 4 times this fall and heard testimony from 42 different people. Some of the striking facts that came out during the testimony were that out of the 800,000 septic systems in Indiana, it's estimated that 200,000 are in failure, so 25% of them. That for our larger cities, the replacement rate for our drinking water and sewage pipes is on about a 140-year cycle, and unfortunately those pipes were meant to last between 50 and 70 years. There's also a keen shortage in certified drinking water and wastewater operators, and that shortage is getting worse as there are retirements. They're having trouble recruiting young people into those jobs. The task force made recommendations, and they made almost all of their recommendations to the executive branch, to the governor's office. And those recommendations included asking the governor to evaluate whether asset management plans should be required at all of our water and wastewater utilities. They also recommended having a central repository of water-related data for the state, and asked the governor to consider having a cabinet-level position to coordinate water activities amongst all of the state agencies involved in water. And then finally, that task force report also recommended that the governor consider creating state water infrastructure study areas. This was a nod to a growing conversation in the state about water resource planning, having regions in the state that share water resources and get together periodically to talk about what the water needs are and what the needs are going into the future, and how much of the resource is available and what its challenges are. The water resource or the water infrastructure task force made that recommendation, and then it made a single recommendation to the legislature, which was to reconvene another task force next year to look at water quality issues. So a couple of interesting bills that didn't pass, but may lead to ongoing conversation. House Bill 1423 was about water resource planning. So introducing the idea I was just talking about that also came up at the task force. House Bill 1369 about confined feeding. We'll hear more about that in just a minute. Again, it was introduced for the first time, started the conversation, and there will be more conversation in the next session. There were two preemptive bills that could have contributed to erosion and sediment pollution problems. House Bill 1096 about construction site runoff, and House Bill 1289 about logging and mining in county zoning. Both of those would have preempted local control, and we'll be hearing more from Commissioner Yoder. In the 2019 session, this is a budget year, and in the budget, we will be watching spending on water infrastructure with the hopes that it will resolve some of the sewage impact on our rivers and lakes. We'll be watching the budget for the agencies, the Department of Environmental Management and the Department of Natural Resources, as well as the budget for Clean Water Indiana, which provides grants for water quality projects. We will be watching for recurrence of the preemption bill on construction site runoff, and of course, we'll be pursuing the confined feeding bill as well. With that, I'd like to introduce our next panelist. Commissioner Mike Yoder is a lifelong dairy farmer who is serving now in his 14th year as an Elkhart County Commissioner. He is president of the Woodland Lakes Land Trust, and he's had leadership roles in the Indiana Farm Bureau, Soybean Alliance, and Dairy Producers Association. We'll be taking questions after all three of us have spoken. Continue to give those to your volunteers. And with that, I'd like to welcome comments from Commissioner Yoder. Thank you.
So, good morning. I almost feel like I need to start by saying, like, this was a self-help group. My name is Mike Yoder. I'm a politician, and I have a CAPO permit. But it's been 1,000 days since I've intentionally lied or polluted, and yeah. So I'm also a jack of all trades and a master of none, as most farmers are, and that suited me very well as a county commissioner. Because however, as a politician, I'm generally not expected to be technically correct or factually accurate most times, but I'm really good at opinions. But I've been asked this morning to talk a little bit because there's some thought here that many of you may not know what MS4 means or what House Bill 1096 was or what Rule 5 is, Rule 13, or have any idea what an MCM is. So typically I would ask one of our staff people to do that because they're experts. I'm going to rely on Kim here some because she is an expert. If there's somebody at your table that looks intelligent and sounds intelligent, and he tells you that what I just told you was wrong, then they're most likely right, okay? So generally, the problems that we have have been talked about fairly well this morning. We're talking about runoff, we're talking about sedimentation, pollutants that are involved with this, illicit discharges, whether it's from a direct pipe or sheet erosion, or sheet drainage, feedlot drainage. So in our county, the sedimentation is showing up in our rivers, it's in our county regulated drains. The city of Goshen has a pond. It's the dam pond. That's a pond that was created by a dam. That is completely full of sediment, essentially, and we're attempting to figure out a way to clean that, at least a portion of that out. And during this policy process, there's been an extra letter added to the word dam. So quickly, at a very high level, when we talk about Rule 5 is essentially is the basic regulatory control that that has to do with anything, anytime you disturb soil over 1 acre. So that's Rule 5. It also, is that the one that establishes the MS4 funds, Rule 5, or is that, it does not? Rule 13 does that. So Rule 13, let's move on to that, is what has allowed some of our counties and cities, if you're in a designated MS4 area, to create an MS4 ordinance or document. So in our Elkhart County, we created a partnership of the MS4 areas. That was the county and 2 of the cities and 1 town. So we have a partnership. The county is designated as the lead. That makes me, by position as president of the county commissioners, as the stormwater coordinator. This is a position that most sane people would not seek, and which I did not. But nonetheless, by position, I am the stormwater king in regulatory king, yes, in Elkhart County. So throughout this and this is, it's the creation of this ordinance that eventually led to House Bill 10, or it's these local stormwater regulatory efforts that eventually led to House Bill 1096, which was an effort to pull some of these local regulatory efforts away from the counties and out to the state level. In Elkhart County, at the county level, we have implemented the very basic Rule 5 regulatory efforts to prevent sedimentation, off-site, whatever is going on. The city of Goshen and the city of Elkhart have regulated those to a higher level, a more stringent level of best management practices. That creates some angst with contractors and eventually with some state legislators who thought, well, it would be better if we created a circumstances where only the most basic regulatory standards could be adopted by the local units of government. This is something which I personally oppose and still do today, in fact, for a variety of reasons, and if we want to get into that, we'll just talk about that during the question time. Some of the things that we are doing, though, and this goes to some ideas that I have that may be helpful as we look at going forward, and how do you work with contractors, and what's the most appropriate way for local government to implement practices that will actually reduce sedimentation, actually make an impact, and in a way that is more business friendly. So some of the things we're doing at the county level, we have implemented a cost share program using stormwater fees. Our stormwater fee is one of the lowest in the state. If you're a homeowner, it costs you $15 a year. That's $15 a year on your property tax. That's our stormwater fee. But in Elkhart County, population of 200-some thousand, we're generating quite a bit of money a year. So my stormwater fund has well over $1 million a year. We have allocated a couple $100,000 of that every year for cost share programs for people who we have identified who have failing septic systems and cannot quite afford to replace it with a mound system or whatever system they need. So we implemented that cost share program, and it's been fairly successful. In addition, working with the Soil and Water Conservation District, we've created a program this year we've called, well, the acronym is SWAMP. It was not my favorite acronym, but that's what they called it. And I don't even remember what it stands for. Stormwater and Water Pollution Prevention something program. Anyways, the target is our agriculture community, because we are a large, even though we have 200-some thousand people, we're a major manufacturing area. We also have a major agriculture, we're one of the major agriculture counties in the state as well. So what we've done is we're actually utilizing these monies to encourage a higher implementation of cover crops. We're doing additional education programming. We're marrying these monies up some with federal dollars to actually create a higher incentive for farmers to actually implement cover crop practices. And I think we'll see here, I think we're going to get this report at the end of the month at our stormwater board meeting, but it appears like this program has been very successful this year in helping get additional acres or additional farmers using cover crops. So that's some of the successful things that we do with just the bare minimum standards. So here's some things I've observed. In Elkhart County, since we've had this stormwater ordinance in place for a number of years, I think we were down to, my technical people say there's about 2% of the contractors that are a problem. Everybody else is beginning to get it. There's a reason we have some of these rules in place, and more contractors, as we work through our educational programs, are beginning to understand why it's important to put these practices to work. So one of the things I think is most important as a county elected body is that, first of all, I'm one that believes that we start out asking for and implementing change in an incremental way. Let's see what we can do to start our contractors and start our builders down a path that creates cleaner water, less sedimentation. So sometimes on the regulatory side, there's this sense of this feeling that we have to come in and put the hammer down and regulate at a very high level, and that's what the cities have done. It's created a lot of significant problems within the city, but on the county level, we're taking a little different approach, as I described. Some of the problems we run into, which I think is good for regulators, for anybody within the regulatory field to understand, is builders want to get stuff done. And so if you're in business, profit is the most important thing, obviously, but we want you to do it right. We find contractors tend to want to take a shortcut. So for example, one of your best management practices, you establish a driveway that prevents that sediment getting on the road. You would like to get some of your retention areas built first. The first thing to do is they start digging the foundation and they start pouring the foundation. We'll get to the other things later. And so the bad folks, not the bad folks, the folks that are not implementing the best management practices, that's what we see most often. So it's a matter of helping our contractors understand that if you follow the procedure, and if the procedure and the practices are reasonable and represent common sense, we can get people to do that. And they'll start staging and sequencing their projects in a proper manner. And I'm going to pause here with just one final thought that I've noticed as an elected official, and I presented this idea first at a listening session somewhere, and someone came up afterwards and said, we have a solution for this. As I've dealt with our staff, we pass a county ordinance, and at the city level, it'll be the Board of Works, that we pass these regulations, and then our staff is asked to implement this. By and large, they just want to be fair. And the way to be fair is you implement the black and white of the rule. So one of our staff people may be on site and there's a practical common sense to get done what we want to get done, but they cannot do that because they think if I fudge on this, then I'm not being fair and equal to everybody else. And so this desire to be fair, this desire to be equal, treat everybody equally, creates situations where our staff implement or force contractors to implement things that just violate common sense and practicality. And that creates rumors within the contractor community and just that whole sense that government is not able to practice common sense or just practical ideas. I don't know how to overcome this because I've sat down with my staff people. I said, I just don't know how to teach common sense other than I've given, and it's not just that they lack common sense, I have given them the permission to say, to just go the common sense way and fudge the rule a little bit if it makes sense. And I'll back you up on that. I don't think most often our regulatory folks, our staff people, get that message from the elected officials. So I think that's important. I'll pause. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Woo. I blow myself away up here. So I really appreciate hearing from an elected official because the topic, and also from a permitted CFO owner, because we're going to be talking about the Indiana's confined feeding rule and the need to bring some common sense into that rule as soon as we get the slideshow going. There we are. So I need to introduce myself, I'm told. My name is Kim Ferraro. I'm the Senior Staff Attorney with the Hoosier Environmental Council. And my role is to do agricultural policy as well at the State House, as well as representing folks who are sometimes overburdened by pollution in a very unfair way. And we often find that that happens in the realm of confined feeding, where our rules currently don't go far enough to protect people. So I'm going to provide a little overview of what confined feeding is, what our current rule requires, and what common sense solutions there are to address those issues. We'll start with talking a little bit about the transformation of farming in recent decades to what is really big industry, how Indiana's environmental laws have really failed to follow that transition to similarly transform, and then, as I mentioned, some legislative solutions to that. Most folks, when they think about where their meat, dairy, and poultry products come from these days, think of a traditional farm that looks somewhat like this one, where cows are free-ranging out in pasture. But the truth is that most of our meat, dairy, and poultry products come from large livestock production operations where vast numbers of animals are crammed and caged into confinement buildings that really look nothing like traditional barns. And because there are so many animals that are confined into one space, the massive amount of feces and urine that are produced by these animals have to be stored and collected somewhere. And that's done either through an earthen manure lagoon that is typically unlined or has a clay liner underneath that, as anybody understands, clay can crack over time and allowing the contaminants in the manure to leach into groundwater. At some sites, the manure is collected into concrete open pits, which if you walk on a sidewalk, you know that over time concrete can fail as well, similarly allowing the contaminants in the manure to leach out. And of course, with the manure lagoons and with these open concrete pits, if it rains a lot and the pit is full, that can oftentimes cause the manure to run over surface water. At some facilities, especially hog facilities, we're seeing very commonly used these underground concrete pits where the animals are over the pits, there's open slats, and the animals defecate and the waste is collected underneath. And again, these are concrete, they do fail over time, and we often see that these facilities under current law are being allowed to build in sensitive areas where there are high water tables. For example, there's a new facility being proposed, a big dairy operation with 1,900 cows being proposed right in the middle of the former lake bed of Beaver Lake, which used to be the largest freshwater lake in Indiana until it was drained in the early 1900s. And our current laws at this point would allow that placement in an area where there's a perched, unconsolidated aquifer that poses very serious groundwater contamination issues for folks whose wells tap into that same aquifer. Another problem then, of course, once those manure lagoons and pits fill up, the waste has to go somewhere, and so it gets spread on the ground. As you heard earlier, I believe from Dr. router, of course, injection is the best way to make sure that we get that the nutrients in that manure beneath the root zones so that the plants can use it. But under Indiana law, injection is not required. They can spray it or spread it. And there's really no oversight. CAFOs get inspected once every 5 years. Whether or not the requirements for land application at agronomic rates are actually being followed is sometimes anybody's guess. Currently, we've got, this is a map of where the CAFOs are in Indiana. We've got 796 CAFOs, which are those that meet the larger animal threshold, regulatory threshold, and then a little over 1,000 confined feeding operations. What this map doesn't tell you is that these facilities are rapidly growing in size with respect to the number of animals at them. Just 5 years ago, when I really started doing this work pretty intensely, the average size permitted hog CAFO was around 5,000. Now we're seeing them being permitted with 5,000 hogs, finishing hogs, wean to finish they call it, or more. To also put some perspective on the numbers there, what this chart is showing you, if you can see it, is our production rankings, how many numbers of animals we're selling every year. We're third nationally for egg production with 25.6 million laying hens. 25.2 million of those are at just 29 facilities, each with the capacity to warehouse 100,000 birds or more. We're fifth in hog production, producing 10.5 million hogs annually, but 9.3 million of those are raised at just 450 confined feeding operations, each permitted to confine in excess of 5,000 hogs. So in other words, what point I'm trying to relay here is that livestock production is no longer farming in the traditional sense. It is very much big industry. And it has very big industrial impacts, including environmental impacts. One of those, of course, is water quality, as Indra mentioned in her presentation. Based on item data, we know that the leading source of water contamination in Indiana is E. coli, which indicates that fecal matter, animal waste, is present. And that contamination, as you saw, is in large part due to releases of human waste. That is part of the problem. Combined sewer overflows, failing septic systems. But we also know that the vast majority of the problem really is due to livestock. And this really makes sense if you just think about the numbers. Livestock in the US generate an estimated 335 million tons of waste annually. That's over 40 times the amount of human waste leaving our US sewage treatment plants. In Indiana, our livestock generate as much urine and feces as that produced by 87 million people, or 14 times the human population of Indiana. And just because this waste comes from livestock instead of humans doesn't mean that it is any less harmful. This is a quote from the US EPA indicating that the pollution strength of raw manure is as much as 110 times greater than that of raw municipal sewage, is therefore arguably more harmful than human waste. But the difference in regulation, I think, is pretty easily seen in this picture. Obviously, there's a wastewater sewage treatment plant that our human waste goes through before it ever gets discharged onto land or into our waterways, versus the photograph of a unlined manure lagoon where the waste is sprayed in there and then spread untreated on nearby parcels when it fills up. And this shows a map of the, from our item recent water assessment, showing that an average of 82% of our stream miles are deemed unsuitable for recreational use because of pathogenic E. coli contamination. In other words, this waste, E. coli waste, livestock waste, animal waste, is getting into our waterways. CAFOs also pose very serious threats to our air quality due to the tremendous amount of waste that they do generate. As that waste decomposes, it off gases. It puts endotoxin, particulate matter, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, other very harmful gases into the atmosphere. And this happens in any number of ways. As I mentioned, with the pits, as the waste decomposes, those harmful pollutants go into the air. When the waste is spread on fields, it gets carried with the wind. And the photo that you see with the big fans, that's a hog CAFO where if they didn't have those ventilation fans that would suck the hydrogen sulfide that gets released out of those barns, the hogs would die. But we're throwing that stuff out, we're pushing those contaminants out into the atmosphere without any sort of air pollution controls to limit the harm that those contaminants would do to folks who live nearby. And we know that that's happening. We know that those emissions are being generated at confined feeding operations based on a Purdue study that was done not long ago. A particular dairy CAFO was looked at as part of that study and found that ammonia emissions were being released at a rate of between 18 and 75 grams per day per cow. In other words, an average-sized dairy CAFO with 1,900 dairy cows will emit as much as 314 pounds of ammonia into the air every day. But that is above the regulatory threshold for other industries under the Clean Air Act, but the Clean Air Act does not apply to agriculture. Those emissions are entirely unregulated. Which brings me to gaps in Indiana law. Our regulation, our confined feeding rule, comes from the Clean Water Act. And so just to define a few terms so that everybody knows what I'm talking about, under the Clean Water Act and Indiana's confined feeding rule, an animal feeding operation, or an AFO, is simply a livestock operation that confines animals and doesn't really grow crops on most of the property. With very few exceptions, AFOs are not subject to regulation or permitting at all. Under our Indiana law, the smaller circle that you see represents confined feeding operations, and confined feeding operations are simply AFOs that confine at least 300 cattle, 600 swine, 30,000 poultry birds, or 500 horses. And then you get to the large concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. And CAFOs in Indiana are CFOs that confine a greater threshold number of animals. So to be specific about that, that would be more than 700 mature dairy cows, more than 1,000 veal calves, more than 2,500 hogs, 10,000 sheep, 55,000 turkeys. In other words, very large numbers of animals. So as I mentioned, with respect to regulatory gaps, AFOs are not regulated unless they are found to have caused a water quality violation. But since they're not regulated or permitted, knowing whether or not those violations happen is largely left to people who live nearby, who may observe something and report it, and then of course that would require some sort of agency response, which may or may not happen. Excuse me. CFOs are largely IDEM regulated by the state, and CAFOs that propose to discharge would have to get a federal Clean Water Act permit, a NIPDES permit. I emphasize propose to discharge for a reason. Are we on? Okay, sorry about that. Just want to make sure that we're lining up there. I'm mentioning that for a reason because there was a federal court case not long ago that's the one we want, that essentially stripped EPA of its authority to regulate CAFOs and require them to be permitted at the federal level. And that's based on this idea of a CAFO being designed to have a discharge. The industry argued that because they're confining the waste in these pits and they aren't discharging that waste through a discrete conveyance or pipe, it's not a discharge. And when they spread it on land, that's simply using the waste as a nutrient to grow crops, so we don't consider that a waste, so therefore we shouldn't have to get these permits. And unfortunately, they won that case. And so now, of those 790 large CAFOs that used to be subject to the federal rule, they have all left the federal rule and are now only regulated by IDEM. So since the rule was updated in 2012 to reflect that change as a result of that federal case, all of the large CAFOs are no longer regulated by EPA. And that has some significant consequences for oversight. So let's talk a little bit about what the Indiana CFO requires. If you're going to construct a new CFO or a new CAFO, you have to get what's called a CFO approval. It's not called a permit. If you're going to increase animal numbers or waste storage capacity, you would also have to get an approval from the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. That approval that you would get does not consider whether land use or siting decisions are appropriate. It does not regulate odors or air emissions. As I mentioned, those are completely exempt from Clean Air Act, Clean Air Act regulation at the federal or state level. And also it requires only that the owners or operators of the CFO or CAFO get the permit, not the integrator or the company that actually owns the animals, which oftentimes are really the entity behind the scenes that are calling the shots. So there's really no accountability for that actor that is involved, a very important actor that's being involved in decision making, including making sure that we're protecting our waterways and air. Under the rule, there are very minimal setbacks. CAFOs and CFOs can be located 100 feet from property lines, 300 feet only from surface waters, drainage, inlets, sinkholes, and off-site water wells, 400 feet from adjacent homes and buildings. And when I'm talking about these setbacks, it's from structure to structure. It is not from the property line. So if you have a home and your home sits 300 feet back from your property line, the CFO can be built 100 feet from its property line and use your 300 feet essentially as an easement. So it's structure to structure. And CAFOs can be 1,000 feet from public water supplies or intake structures. Unlike other permitting schemes under the Clean Water Act or Clean Air Act, there's really secret record keeping here. The operating record for land application, inspections that CAFO owners would have to do get to be kept on site. They don't have to be submitted to the agency, unlike a discharge monitoring report that a sewage treatment plant, for example, would have to submit. And that's a problem because we don't get to now see what's going on. You know, if it's submitted to an agency, it's a public record, and you would be able to have access to that to understand if the facility is being operated responsibly. So really no meaningful mechanism for transparency or oversight. IDEM also has very limited authority under the current CFO rule because if a CFO, a proposed new CFO, meets those minimum requirements, there is no discretion really for IDEM to deny the permit, even if there were clear evidence that putting that CAFO at the proposed location would have substantial impacts on public health through the air emissions that the CAFO generates and for the E. coli. I forgot to mention this in regulatory gaps. The focus of the CFO rule is in limiting nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen. It is not aimed at limiting E. coli. And the reason that's important is because the setbacks would be very different if we were looking at trying to protect our waters from E. coli contamination versus nutrients, because they travel through the environment in a very different way. The other problem is the way this plays out, given IDEM's limited authority, is we know that since 2012, with that rule change, not one permit has ever been denied by the agency. So what are the common sense solutions? Last year, we did get the conversation started on this with House Bill 1369 and Senate Bill 316. And what these legislative solutions would do would really bring common sense into the rule. That's really what we're looking for. Oftentimes this issue, unfortunately, devolves into us versus them. that if you want common sense legislation, somehow you're anti-farmer or anti-CAPO. And I can tell you categorically that that is not what this is about. This is about regulating big industry impacts in a way that is responsible. And that shouldn't be us versus them. We should all want to protect our water and air. So what would the bill do? We're going to be introducing it again this year. We need your help to get it passed. Here's why. It would give IDEM authority to deny a permit to build or expand a CFO if that would cause harm to the to human health of the environment beyond just the limited focus on nutrients. It would give IDEM the authority to revoke a permit if a CAFO becomes a public health or environmental threat or a nuisance to its neighbors. It would give IDEM the authority to set air pollution limits through an odor standard. It would require full disclosure of all persons or entities that are involved in making decisions, including the integrator. And it would provide Hoosiers with a meaningful voice and ability to protect their homes and families by imposing the same public notice and commenting requirements that are required under the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, where the agency actually has to consider those public comments in its decision-making and respond to those comments. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention this in this presentation, that there is also something we can all do. We don't have to wait for policy change immediately today, and that's through making good food choices and really knowing where your food comes from to make the responsible choice to reduce at least your meat consumption, and certainly not buy your dairy and meat from industrial ag. Get it from local farmers that are doing things right. And here's why. Because if you're a vegan, to feed you for a year, it will take 1/6 of an acre. If you're a vegetarian, 3 times as much land as a vegan, or half an acre. If you're a meat eater, 18 times as much land to feed you for a year, 3 acres as a vegan, or 3 acres, more than, excuse me, I am losing my tongue, 18 times more than the vegan, or 3 acres. 1/2 of an acre can produce 37 pounds of plant-based food and versus 375 pounds of meat, and that's because of the inefficiencies that are involved there. Is the grain that we're growing now, most of it is going to feed animals instead of humans. And each day, a person who eats a vegan diet saves 1,100 gallons of water, 45 pounds of grain, 30 square feet of forested land, and 20 pounds of CO2 equivalent in one animal's life. So you can make a huge impact on the environment just based on your food choices. And that's it for me. Look forward to questions from all of you for the panel.
Oh, it looks like we have an engaged audience. Thank you for your questions. Commissioner Yoder, the first question is directed to you.
No, I'm not a vegan.
No. And it's asking for your comments on the proposal for confined feeding regulatory reform.
I had
1369.
a notion. Somebody asked that, so I was writing notes quickly here because this is the first I'd heard about it. I'm actually, I sold the milking cows last year and so I'm raising heifers, so I don't quite have the cow numbers or the young heifer animals to qualify as a CAFO, so I have not been following these regulations quite as closely. So I just told Kim that I'd forgotten what it was like to be in a presentation with her. It's been a lot of years. There's always the other side of the story, and there's one here, and I feel like I'm ultimately not even qualified to talk at her level of expertise. I have a few issues here, and they're mostly larger policy type issues that agriculture, we talked earlier about the Farm Bill being passed. Generally, for years, the purpose of the Farm Bill is to create surplus ag commodities, to keep food cheap. And so what we're living in right now is we're living in a circumstance with agriculture that it demands, if you want low-cost feed, it demands these larger livestock operations. So we need some reasonable expectations. I'm not going to argue with Kim that there are some concerns out there, but again, we're talking about, I think, more of a minority of folks that are not operating properly, less of a number that are polluting. But unfortunately, one big problem creates a big problem in a community, so I understand that. I'm a little leery about having IDEM start controlling air pollution. I'm not the local animal setbacks can be, the setbacks of these operations can be controlled with local zoning. So I would rather have the local folks set those standards so you can set those back. I hope this thought she's reaching for a microphone. A pen. I'll even give you a pen. My history is I'm really leery about having IDEM have so much regulatory control. There's a proper place for that. There's also a proper place for local control that can do some of this and much quicker. I'll tell you right now, if you want to increase setbacks for these operations in your county, you can do it quicker through your local zoning board than they'll ever get it done in the state.
Am I on? Again, I very much appreciate you coming up here on a panel with me. I think this is a dialogue that really has to happen and unfortunately doesn't happen often enough. So I appreciate it, but of course you know I'm going to have a response to what you said. So I agree, we can agree that local level decision making can go further. So we don't want to eliminate that. That is a very good thing. I'm totally with you. And by proposing better IDEM regulation, we're not proposing to strip that ability of locals to go further. The idea, though, is to create a baseline of protection across counties, because there are some counties, as you probably know, that are not willing to go further. And so what happens is you have communities where they learn that a new facility is coming in, they go to the locals and they say, oh, help us with this. You know, our setbacks aren't sufficient, and the county will say, that's IDEM's problem because IDEM regulates that. And then they go to IDEM, and IDEM says, oh, land use siting with CAFOs is a local problem. So folks get a circular runaround. And so, again, what we're wanting to do with this rule is to create a baseline of protection, not eliminate local control.
Yeah. No. Thank you. It's good dialogue. And actually, another question for Commissioner Yoder, going back to the stormwater issue. If House Bill 1096 were to pass, would that have an effect on the stormwater programs that you have in Elkhart County?
Well, I think potentially, and here was, so this is my conservative spin on this. One of my senators was a proponent of this. And what he was attempting to do is to create a lower level of regulatory control. And what I told him is the exact opposite was going to happen, because I've spent some time talking working with Kim and others at the state level. And once this gets into the rulemaking process, it becomes much more stringent and much more controlling. And what I was concerned about is I think that the best management practices that are needed in southern Indiana may be different than they are in northern Indiana. They may be different in our county based on our soil types and our terrain than it might be in a different county. So I think this particularly needs to be done at the local level just to get the best management practices.
Okay, great, thank you. And going back to the confined feeding issue, would it be possible to have a tax on meat at the retail level to pay for sewage treatment plants for animal feeding operations? Kim, you want to start on that one, and then?
I would just respond that anything is possible. I don't know about how well that would go over, and I think at this point, what we do have on the table is a way to help the agency that already has control over the regulatory process here, to give that agency the authority authority that it needs to protect our waterways and air. I'd love to learn more about that idea. I just don't know that I have much else to add to that.
Sure. Commissioner Yoder?
Right, so my response to that is that if manure is properly stored and properly managed and properly applied, I'm not sure that treatment is necessary.
Yeah.
We only have 2 minutes.
Well, I would, let me just add to that. There are technologies out there that can, biodigesters, for example. There are technologies that can treat manure before it's landed by. The problem with that is that it kind of has a perverse effect of giving the larger operators a leg up because they can afford it, whereas the smaller ones can't. So if you want to make it a full-on requirement so that everybody has to do it and level the playing field, that may be arguably one way, but I think part of it is also just first, get the low-hanging fruit, address the things that are really pretty easy and common sense before we try to tackle larger issues like that.
Okay. And in the interest of time, I'll take just I've got one final question. These are excellent questions, and we get to continue this discussion in the breakout sessions later on this afternoon. So I'll bring these along to the breakout session that I'm part of. And this question is, can these data be extrapolated to include every water body, or is this site-specific? And I understand the question to be referring to the IDEM report on water monitoring and water quality. The way IDEM reports it, it's each site has either an impairment or doesn't have impairment. It certainly gives us a picture of where we are as a state, but no, they have not assessed every single water body and every single stream mile. Over the years that IDEM has had the program, they've accumulated assessment data on those total numbers that I presented in my presentation. So, for example, the 32,800 some odd miles of stream that have been assessed for water body or for full body contact, that's over the entire course of IDEM's water monitoring assessment program. That wasn't just their 2018 data. It tells us something about the state, but it doesn't tell you specifically what's going on in any particular water body. With that, we'll wrap up this presentation, and I believe, Tim, are you up next? Thank you for your attention. We have a couple more awards and then on to lunch.